chapter 2. Any questions relating to chapter 1 or finding your way around Blackboard or anything like that? Is everybody doing okay, or do I need to review anything?
One question I had pertains to, well, actually, I don't have a question.
I didn't hear all that, Evan. Try again.
It's okay. I don't have a question.
Sure?
Yeah, I'm sure.
All right. So I am going to do a share screen here. So chapter 2 is a little bit of history around the field of motor development. Some of it I'm going to cover very briefly. The really old stuff is, for me, less important, but it's important that you know it happened and that it's there, but because some of the data we still use from the older theories, but the theory itself isn't supported in the same way anymore. So we're not going to spend too much time on the older theories. Okay. So let's imagine that someone in your family, okay, has a baby, you dash home to go congratulate them and see the baby, right? And so what you get at that first visit is this individual who cannot move by choice, all right? So any movement you see in that first visit is involuntary, right? So they're not able to move their arms or their head or anything on their own at this time, okay? So this is a really helpless, reliant being, right? That without its parents or caregivers could not survive, okay? Then you come back to school, you get really busy with life, etc., and your next trip home is about 8.5, 9 months later. And this time, what you see is this smiling, gurgling, funny little being who looks very, very different and behaves very, very different to your first visit, right? So by this point, this child is able to sit up. It's reaching for toys or for your hand. It's able to self-locomote if it's typically developing, so it can get around the house on its own, right? And this is a completely different scenario to your first trip, right? So just in 8.5, 9 months, this individual went from not being able to move, not being able to see very well, to something that can move on its own, can sit on its own, is going to be making some kind of noises, probably not talking per se, but certainly gurgling and laughing and being a whole load of fun, right? 9, 10 months is a lot of fun, okay? So very, very different. And so what we want to understand is, how did that happen, right? What occurred in that period of time that made this dramatic change? Okay? So the theories that the chapter looks at, they really split into three groups. The first group is maturational perspective. So theories that fall under the maturational perspective are going to look at the idea that the baby changes as the nervous system matures. Okay? Then we have perspective number 2, which is called information processing. And theories that sit under an information processing perspective look at changes in a human in relation to the brain kind of working like a computer. Okay? And then our third perspective is the ecological perspective. And that umbrella is where our triangle, our constraints theory, sits. Okay? So, as I mentioned, in the maturational perspective, the people that ran research under this idea thought that motor development was driven by the maturation of the system. So it's a nature argument, right? So it's down to genetics and hereditary, and they were specifically honed in on the development of the central nervous system, controlling changes in motor development. And they really did not take much interest in the environment that the child was in. They believed that the environment had very minimal influence. So you may have heard of an old kind of argument that used to go on, nature versus nurture. All right? Maturational researchers were very much nature driven. Okay? So they, while now, and when we talked about our triangle theory, we said that the environment could speed up or slow down motor development. And they kind of thought that, like, if the child was severely underdeveloped, that could be due to some malnutrition or something like that. But they didn't think that the environment could change anything, right? The course forward is hardwired, and it's going to happen pretty much no matter what. Okay? So in the 1930s, it wasn't called motor development, but it came under more of an umbrella of PE type titles. Then there were a couple of researchers called Giesel and McGraw, and they did a lot of work with infants and young children, and they suggested that there was a genetically determined sequence of development, but that individuals could have unique timing within a limited window, right? McGraw very much associated these motor behavior changes with the development of the nervous system, and said that the advancement in the nervous system, particularly the central nervous system, so the brain and the spinal cord, triggered the appearance of new motor skills. Right? So this is a key idea, because for a very, very long time, this type of research and this perspective influenced the training of PE teachers. It influenced parenting beliefs for many, many years. And, you know, I might be cynical, but I would say there are still people around that think that's how things happen, right? So that our basic motor skills emerge automatically. So those skills that we looked at in lab on our MSU chart and our TGMD, right? Those are going to emerge automatically. And the rate might be individual to the child, but the sequence is automatic, hardwired. It's going to happen, right? We don't need particular training for it to happen because these basic skills are driven by the development of the brain, right? And mild deprivation, therefore, would not change the course of that developmental trend, that pathway. And the most important system in the body for motor development is the nervous system, and other systems like our skeletal system, our muscular system, our cardiovascular system, our digestive system, our hormonal system. All of those had played little significance in what we see occur movement-wise, right? So the PE literature at this time was very descriptive. They often would look at the process that was going on, so the mechanics of the skill from the 1940s up until the early 70s. They would look at biomechanical descriptions of the changes in the movement. And often they were measuring the product, the outcome of the movement, not what was happening in the movement. Okay, so they would use quantitative scores, numerical scores, to describe children's average performances. All right? And that's really all I want to talk about on maturation theory. As I said, it's important that you understand that foundation because of the impact it had on PE teachers and parents and their belief systems around motor skills, okay? But don't spend a lot of time. That's really what you need to know, that little capsule that I've given you. The chapter goes into quite a lot more information. By all means, read that, enjoy it, but that deeper information is not something we're going to be spending time on and testing and things. All right, just that little window that I've given you. So our second perspective is very interesting for me, the information processing perspective, because when I was an undergrad a very, 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 very long time ago, ecological perspective did not exist. Motor development was not a named area of study. And so when I was in undergrad, all my motor behavior training fit under this information processing perspective. And try as I might, sometimes it still is the first thing that comes to mind when I'm considering something. So what the information processing researchers believed, and this is where our nature-nurture argument started. So this was in late 60s and into the 70s and into the early 80s, right? So we have this, they think it's more about nurture, that the brain acts like a computer, and you feed that computer information, and it outputs movement skills, right? So in this model, we have a relatively passive human being who responds to stimuli that the computer, the brain, is receiving from the environment, right? So we've got these important ideas of input, encoding, processing, feedback, And we really think that the brain is like a complex computer. The central nervous system is the hardware, the mental processes, so things like attention span, motivation, those are the software, all right? And it's really the first time we see researchers interested more in the process of what is happening than the outcome of what is happening. So I'm going to draw you a little baby version of a model here. Move that up here. All right, so this is a very simplified model of the idea of information processing, all right? Because we like things to be simple. And once we understand them, we can build on that foundation and make them a bit more complicated if we want to. So we go this, and then okay, so box 1 is the input. Okay, if we were talking computer language, box 1 would be input. All right, so in movement terms, box 1 is the stimulus. Okay, so that could be a ball flying through the air that I see, right? So my retina and my visual cortex sees the ball, sends that information to the central nervous system. And the middle box is where it gets really interesting. Okay? The middle box, we can label processing, but that's a little simple, all right? Because what really goes on there is very complicated. Like this middle box is the whole key to information processing theories, all right? So think about our computer, right? The input comes in, so the stimulus comes in and is received by the processing box, right? So the first thing that has to happen is the brain has to recognize what that information is, okay? Because it's just a piece of electricity that hits the brain. So the brain has to recognize, so under processing we've got recognition, right? Then it has to do the really tricky work of decision making, right? If I recognize there's a ball flying through the air, what am I going to do about that, right? So decision making is a huge part of this processing. And it takes a lot of time, okay? Because think of all the choices I've got. If a ball is flying through the air, I can move my hands and I can catch it. Or I can move my feet and I can try and kick it. Or I can move my head and try and hit it with my head. Or I can step out of the way and let it go past me because I don't want to try any of those, right? So there's all these options of what to do with this ball. So that takes a lot of time. The brain has to go this one, this one, this one, this one, or this one. Okay? So we've got recognition, we've got decision making. Okay? Then we have to make movement choice. So now I have to program the actual movement to meet the decision that I've made on what I want to do. Make sense? And once I've picked the motor program, so in information processing, they think of think of it like a filing cabinet, right? And the brain opens the drawer and it's got all these files, it's got all these options for movement patterns. And it picks a movement pattern, and then it has to initiate that movement pattern. So you can see there's a lot going on. We can simplify it by calling it processing, because this is a very simple model. But there's tons of stuff going on under this heading, right? So the brain has initiated the movement pattern, and then our last box, if we were talking computer language, would be the output, right? It would be the bit of paper that's coming out of the printer with something on it, or the coding that's turning up on the screen, right? The output. In our motor world, the output is the movement, right? So whatever it is the brain decided I was going to do in response to this ball flying through the air gets initiated, and I move my hands and catch the ball, right? That's the output, the movement, okay? Now, having caught the ball, I've got lots and lots of information, or not caught the ball, right? I've got lots of information to learn from about that movement pattern, particularly if the movement pattern was unsuccessful, okay? So now we get this feedback loop through the sensory system, and that feedback gets, well, actually that's incorrect. Let me do this. The feedback really comes in here to the processing box. Ignore this bit. Okay? And so the brain says, okay, I moved my hands too early, or I moved them too late, or I moved them in the wrong direction, or I moved the arms, all the arm movement was good, and then I forgot to close the fingers and actually catch the ball. Right? There's all this information that comes back to the brain, and the brain files it away with the movement pattern, so that the next time it initiates that movement pattern, it'll be slightly different based on this feedback. Questions? So in the 70s, they were often looking at young adults rather than children, and then they were using that information as comparison data for younger children and older adults, and it fell much more under the motor learning, cognitive psychology kind of area of motor behavior. And then when they were comparing that data to PE children, then that's where we had a little bit of what we would now call some motor development information. Now, the reason that I'm giving more information on this perspective is that today it's still a very viable option for research. Right? A lot of researchers use information processing theories as a tool. Right? It's thinking of the brain like a computer is comfortable for them, it makes sense to them, and so their approach to looking at motor skills is founded in theories that sit under this perspective. Okay? So it's not outdated in the same way that maturational theory is outdated now. All right, although we still use the data, because the data was very advanced for its time, so we still use the data from the maturational researchers, but the theories themselves, this idea that only the nervous system drives the development of motor skills, that's not really believed anymore, okay? But these theories are still very much in use, particularly by people under the motor learning umbrella, but some motor development people also use info processing theories. So one of the fields that sits under the umbrella of information processing is something that we call perceptual motor development. And it started with a desire to show that learning disabilities in the classroom, children who had learning disabilities also had delayed motor development, and that what they thought was that there was some disconnect between the perception of the stimulus and the initiation of the motor program, and that somehow that was also linked to learning issues in the classroom. And so by the 70s, they were looking at perceptual motor programs. So they were running these interventions for children who had learning disabilities in the classroom to try to correct this disconnect between perception and action. And so a lot of what we know about perceptual motor behavior and perception action comes from the research that was done under that information processing approach. And there's a chapter later on in the book that is based on perception action and perceptual motor theories. Hopefully we will have time to cover that chapter. All right. The outcome of these perceptual motor programs wasn't as positive as they had hoped in respect to impacting the learning disability that was occurring in the classroom. So it really didn't change that, but it did provide all these amazing movement experiences for these children. So it wasn't completely negative, it just didn't have the final outcome that they were planning for. Right? And then we come to our third perspective. And this started in the 80s. If you remember, I said that the constraints theory was published in 1986. And that ecological perspective takes an interesting approach, because instead of choosing sides, right, this is how I discuss it with myself in my brain, right? Instead of choosing sides, is it nature or nurture? The theories that sit under ecological umbrella say it's not one or the other, it's this amazing interrelationship, this interaction between the environment and the person. And then when we look at constraints theory, they add in also the task, right? So there's multiple systems that are important. I can't just look at the nervous system, because if the muscular system wasn't developed enough, it wouldn't matter how much the nervous system was developed. The muscles wouldn't be able to move the skeleton, right? And so it's a big shift in the approach to movement. And I am very geeky about motor development, it's true. But for me, what was exciting when I got to grad school, so this was a long, long time, this was like 20 odd years after I graduated from undergrad. When I got to grad school, I had never heard of ecological theory or constraints theory. And it just blew my mind when I read this stuff, because when I had graduated as an undergrad, I went into coaching gymnastics full-time. That was my job. And so, because I had taken exercise science as an undergrad, sometimes I would be in the gym watching one of my kids do something, and I would try to relate it back to the theories that I had learned in school. And I'd sit there and I'd be like, I just don't have anything that explains what I'm seeing. Right? None of my information processing theory really explains the behavior that I'm observing. I can't pin it down. And that used to drive me crackers as a coach, because if I can't pin down the reason for the behavior, it makes it more difficult to try to correct the behavior. Right? So that went on for many years. Then I get to grad school and I find out about this, and I'm like, oh my God. That explains so much of what I used to see. Now I have a tool that I can use personally to help me be a better teacher, coach, therapist, whatever I'm going to be, right? Because this tool explains this. This tool explains something else, right? It's not a question of picking one tool over the other tool. It's how many tools can I gather so that when I'm faced with a problem, I've got all these tools to use to try to resolve the problem. Does that make sense? Right? That's the key of being in school. Right? It's not a, this is how we do it. It's a, how many pieces of information can I pull together so that I can resolve a problem. Okay? So now we're looking at this amazing interaction between the person, the who, right? The environment, the where, and the task, the what. And we start to consider that motor development doesn't sit within a little window of time in this developing person. It can occur across the lifespan as these constraints change, right? So the neural system, the maturation theory system, right, is just one of many systems that's responsible for the observable action that we get. Right? So what I like about ecological theories is that they can describe and explain and predict motor development. And if I can predict it, I can plan for it in my lessons and my teaching. Right? So now I have the opportunity to think about, you know, it's how I move is related to the task. It's related to the environment, but also to my body, my mindset at that time. It's this interplay of all these different factors, right, that we call constraints. Okay? So ecological perspective theories that sit under there tend to fall into one of two branches. Either a dynamical systems approach, which is where our constraints theory would sit, or a perception action approach, which builds on a lot of the information from the perceptual motor programs in the 60s. All right? So the main difference between information processing theories and ecological theories is that the first is based on this idea of a central governor, right? Whereas ecological theories is based on the idea that perception is direct to all these systems, and the systems can self-assemble. They don't necessarily need instructions from the central governor. questions? No questions? Are you sure that all made sense? Because it's taken me about 30 years to learn all that stuff. All right, maybe by, what day is today? Tuesday. Maybe by Thursday, if you've done a little bit more digging into the chapter and the notes, you'll have some questions on Thursday. All right? Because it's not rocket science, right? But it isn't exactly English 101. All right? There are a lot of abstract ideas floating around in the information I'm giving you today. All right? So things that are abstract are harder to understand and to learn than something that's very tangible, that I can touch, that I can see. Right? So I want you to really think through this information and come back to me with questions if you have any. Okay? All right, we'll just do a little bit more because, as I said, this has been a lot of information at one go, and I don't want to do the whole chapter at one time because I want you to be able to think about it a little bit. All right? And absorb it a bit. So we'll just do a little bit more. We'll start talking about the dynamical systems approach, just carefully, all right, because we don't want to get into the math of dynamical systems. So, as I said, dynamical systems originated in some crazy scientific field like astrophysics or something, where they were looking at how certain things appear to self-organize. So the best way I can explain it to you is something that you can see back at home in the UK, but actually I've been seeing it over by the walking trail in the evenings. If you go out to the walking trail as the sun is starting to set, there's this huge flock of birds, thousands of birds, and they lift up off the ground and they move in this kind of amazing ribbon of a dance, so it looks like one thing, right? It just looks like a mist, right? And they're all moving together in this amazing, what they call a murmur, right? But it's not one thing. It's thousands of things that are all organizing together to make this shape, right? They all move together. And it's not like the bird at the front is talking to the bird at the back, because there's hundreds of them, right? So this is the idea of dynamical systems, is that these different pieces of the system can self-organize into a movement pattern without being told what to do. And that's the best way I can explain it to you. That's the way I explain it to myself. Because as I said, the actual dynamical systems theory is crazy complicated. Tons of math. I only understand a little tiny piece of it that I had time to study when I was in grad school. So I'm trying to kind of make it manageable for you. All right? So the application of dynamical systems theory to movement and motor development happened in the early 80s by a group of researchers, Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey, So if you ever Google dynamical systems, or you go into a library database and Google dynamical systems, one of the papers you will see is one of the early ones by Kugler, Kelso, and Turvey, or some other combination of those three names, depended who took the lead on the paper. And so, as I said, the idea is that my body systems can spontaneously self-organize. They don't necessarily need to be driven by a message from the brain, from the central nervous system. So that motor program from the brain takes time, right, to leave the brain and get to a muscle group to make it react. So what these researchers were investigating was the idea that sometimes we don't need that central motor pattern. Sometimes the bits of the body can self-organize appropriately in response to the environment. So for example, if I'm walking along, right, and I'm not paying attention, so like Sunday morning, I was out at the trail with my phone, FaceTiming my dad while I was walking, right? So I'm walking around, but I'm not looking at the trail, I'm looking at my dad, right? So it would have been very easy, luckily it's not what happened, but it would have been very easy to step on a rock or something and turn my ankle a little bit, right? So if that happens and I had to wait for a signal from the brain to respond to that imbalance, I would probably have fallen over, right? But what happens is, and the rest of my body kind of self-organizes to catch me up so I don't fall, right? And it happens in a way that cannot possibly depend upon a signal from the brain. Now, there might be some feedback loops going through the spine, okay? But that's not quite the same thing as information processing that says everything comes from here. Okay? So it's not a right or a wrong, it's a different approach to analyzing what we see happen. Okay? So in this situation, instead of the movements being hardwired by the brain all the time, we would say that movements can be soft-wired at a different level. Okay. And because under ecological theories we recognize that all systems in the body play a role in the movement pattern that we see, right? Then we can start to think about, well, which system is predominant right now? You know, at certain times of your life, one system is driving what you see. So for example, in puberty, the skeletal system is the first system to change very dramatically, right? And it totally changes the movement pattern that this child exhibited from 6 months ago to now. Okay? So these systems all develop in their own timelines. Okay? And when we get to the other end of the lifespan, systems break down at different rates, right? And that change in the system then changes the motor pattern that we see. Okay? So these changes in systems can be called rate limiters. All right? So a rate limiter is the system. So if we start off at the early end of the lifespan, The rate limiter is the system that is developing the most slowly and holding back the next skill. Right? So it's the one that develops last during a period of growth, and it's limiting the next change in movement pattern. Right? If we go to the other end of the lifespan, right, and we're looking at older adults, at the elderly, then the rate limiter is the one that declines to a critical point first and changes the movement pattern. Right? So rate limiters are individual constraints because we're talking about systems of the body. Okay? So a rate limiter is always an individual constraint. And it's the slowest system necessary for a particular movement to occur, or it's the system that's declining the fastest that then prevents a movement occurring any further. Okay. If you're someone that likes graphs and visuals, then this set of graphs in your textbook might be helpful for you. Right? If you're not someone who likes graphs, ignore them and just follow the words. Okay? But what the graphs are trying to represent is System A, System 1, 2, 3, and 4. And you can see that they all change at different points over the time period, right? And so that means that the behavior that I would remember our emerging arrow out of our circular set of arrows on our triangle, the emerging arrow shows the movement pattern that we're going to observe, right? So what they're trying to show here is that these four systems are all changing at different times, and so the behavior that we get, that we can see over this time period, changes in relation to the changes in the system. Right? So as I said, if the graphs help you to coalesce that idea, great. If they don't, ignore them. Right? Don't spend time looking at something that you just go, oh my God, this is so confusing, I don't understand. Then ignore it, put a piece of paper over it. Right? If looking at the graphs you go, oh my God, okay, I get it, then use the graphs. Right? And I'm going to stop there. I know it's early, but one of the things I don't like about Tuesday, Thursday classes is that they're a little bit long, and if I keep going, your brains are going to explode, and I would like you to have some time, right? You've got 20 minutes or so to kind of let this information soak in, have a flick through these pages in the chapter, maybe rehash the ideas of the 3 different types of perspectives. Right? Use your time wisely. It's not exactly free time, right? It's 20 minutes for you to absorb this quite abstract information. Okay? Because that will make your learning much more usable. And we want to be planning on learning, not memorizing. Right? And learning takes practice, just like it does for any of our movement skills. Okay? Questions? Okay? All right, so I will see you tomorrow for lab. And I believe we are going to watch some videos and practice using our MSU Charm TGMD3. I think that's the next line on the syllabus. Okay, so I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great afternoon and stay safe.